Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us in this session on the National Day of Action, National Day of Remembrance and Action on Violence Against Women. Very happy that you were able to join us here today. This is, I believe, the 10th session as part of Nova Scotia Human Rights Week on a very important subject. My name is Jeff Overmars. I'm a communications advisor at the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission. I'll introduce the topic and our panelists in just a moment, but wanted to begin by acknowledging that we're attending this virtual session in Mi'kma'ki, the traditional and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq Nation. The Mi'kmaq have made this land their home since time immemorial, and they are the past, present, and future caretakers of this land. The commission embraces Mi'kmaq teachings such as Imsit Nugama, meaning all my relations, which respects the inherent interconnectivity of all beings. And it's our responsibility to imbue that teaching in our work, in our care for one another, and our care for community. I would also like to recognize the fundamental foundational work that members of the African, Nova Scotian, and Black community have done to advance dignity and rights for not only their own community, but for all communities in Nova Scotia. African Nova Scotians have made their home in Mi'kma'ki for more than 400 years. And during that time, despite oppression, systemic racism, anti-Black racism, and being denied such things as land titles, African Nova Scotians have advocated for the rights of their communities and others, and their advocacy has led directly to the establishment of the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission and the drafting of the Nova Scotia Human Rights Act. And so the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission continues their work, building upon their advocacy and achievements, and in so doing, hope that we can recognize their work continually. I will just say that today's session was coordinated largely by Brianna Miller, who is the coordinator of the National Gender-Based Violence Settlement Sector. Apologies, folks. Then she is the coordinator of the National Gender-Based Violence Settlement Sector Strategy Champion Network and Working Group, and also the Nova Scotia Gender-Based Violence Prevention Project. I apologize, my ability to read off screen is not super great. I will be passing it over to Brianna in just a moment to introduce the rest of today's panelists. I just wanted to point out to anyone needing to avail themselves of ASL, we do have 2 interpreters on the call today. They'll be swapping in and out. Should you wish to pin or spotlight them, you have the ability to do so, so please do. Also, closed captions are enabled on this Zoom webinar, so you're able to click those on at the bottom of the screen. And the chat is not enabled for this webinar, but the Q&A is active. And so at any point throughout any of the presentations or discussions here today, if you have the opportunity, or you do have the opportunity rather, to drop a question into that Q&A box, and we have allotted some time at the end of the discussion to turn to submitted questions. So without further ado, Brianna, over to you, and thank you again so much for your leadership in coordinating today's panel.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining, and thank you, everyone, for being involved here today. So today we are going to be spending the next little while focusing on gender-based violence prevention and support for newcomers, immigrants, migrant workers, refugees. And in particular, we're going to do a little bit of an intersectional approach to even further look into that between the intersectionalities of sexual orientation and gender, those living with disabilities, and as well as status. And so I'm going to introduce our other speakers directly before they speak, just to kind of give context for each of them. But for right now, I'm going to start with just a bit of an overview of gender-based violence and coming from the settlement sector's kind of opinion and experience on that. So I'm just going to share screen. Hopefully everyone can see. So again, the context where I'm coming from, I do work in a immigrant serving organization. The YMCA Center for Immigrant Programs does provide settlement services to newcomers here to Nova Scotia. We provide services to children, youth, and adults, anything from language support to recreation, social, as well as crisis support, settlement integration, employment navigation, LGBTQ support, um, and much, much more. And so one of the programs in our center is gender-based violence. So that's where I work. So our gender-based violence prevention program has a local and a national component. So I'm going to be bringing in the expertise and kind of information from both of those. Our gender-based violence local program is essentially there to build capacity of service providers to better support newcomers around gender-based violence. We do this through free trainings and opportunities. And then we also do direct client work with newcomers to raise awareness about gender-based violence, as well as focusing on prevention. We are partners and leading a national gender-based violence strategy for agencies serving immigrants. It's a collaboration between the anti-violence and the settlement sector, and it provides free bilingual tools and resources across the country for people working with newcomers around gender-based violence. And I will highlight that this webinar is very short, but we do have a free online certified training as well on our website. So, what is gender-based violence? We're going to be talking about that. So, gender-based violence is any violence that is committed against someone based on their gender identity, gender expression, or perceived gender. And sexual and gender-based violence refers to any act that is perpetrated against someone's will and is based on gender norms and unequal power relationships and encompasses threats of violence and coercion. As you can see on the graphic, there's lots of different ways and forms that can take place, from harassment, physical abuse, sexual abuse, financial, verbal, trafficking, early or forced marriage, anything related with technology and cyber violence, so-called honor killing, emotional abuse, and often we see this targeted specifically violence against women and girls, violence against the 2S LGBTQIA plus community, family violence, intimate partner violence, and again, as we said, sexualized violence and human trafficking. So there's lots of different forms that this can take. I do want to highlight that gender-based violence is an urgent priority. These are some statistics. I know there's quite a lot of them, but I just want to highlight a few of them on the screen. 35% of women worldwide have experienced either physical or sexual intimate partner violence. 86% of domestic violence files in 2021 were designated as high risk for fatality involving female victims. That was according to a Nova Scotia fact sheet. Every 6 days, a woman is killed by her partner in Canada, so people's lives are at risk. I'm going to jump to a few other statistics. 59% of LGBTQ plus people in Canada have experienced physical or sexual assault since the age of 15. I also want to note that 63% of women with disabilities who experienced homelessness said it was because of violence. And so that's another kind of intersection we need to be mindful of. And transgender people are 4 times more likely than cisgender people to experience violent crimes. Men and boys are less likely to report intimate partner and domestic violence due to stigma. However, men and boys can be victims of all forms of gender-based violence. However, statistically, women and girls and those who are gender diverse still experience at a higher rate. And I do want to acknowledge that 77 countries globally still criminalize same-sex activity. So with these statistics in mind, gender-based violence is an urgent priority. I also just want to highlight and center that even in Nova Scotia, it's a very big problem. Nova Scotia has the highest rates of intimate partner violence in Canada, and it was declared an epidemic in September. So before I transition into newcomers, I just want to acknowledge that violence occurs in all communities, regardless of socioeconomic status, country, culture, age, race, religion, ethnicity, and all other characteristics. However, certain populations, as you can see on the right, are at a higher risk of experiencing violence and facing increased barriers, including women and girls, Indigenous, LGBTQ, gender nonconforming, those living in rural areas, those with disabilities, newcomers, youth, children, and seniors. And that is because of systemic issues and barriers. So we do want to just highlight that we are going to be focusing on newcomers today, but we want to acknowledge that violence happens in all communities. When we're talking about newcomers, it's important that we acknowledge that there are lots of barriers during settlement that impact and contribute to people being at higher risk. So in general, language challenges, language makes it hard to build peer supportive networks, access employment, and even just navigating systems. There could also be trauma related to the migration process, settling in Canada, or trauma from reasons why someone might have left if there was war or conflict. Adjusting to a new culture, underemployment and the difficulty finding a job, as well as the loss of income and status. Oftentimes, people come with incredible skills and experience and cannot find a job, and this puts a lot of pressure on families and can also impact relationships and mental well-being. There's lots of others like housing and racism and accessing other supports. For youth, I'm only going to highlight a couple on the screen, but I do want to acknowledge that a lot of youth who are coming here may have had gaps in education. Particularly if some have had no education, full education, but in a different language, or a severe gap due to a conflict, war, or displacement. This is really challenging. We also know there's shifting of familial roles. So often children and youth are taking on roles of parents and guardians because they adjust faster. This places children and youth in a position where they're advocating with landlords, banking, doing all the appointments, and this transition of roles can sometimes cause challenges in families. Also, balancing cultural identities. The pressure to fit in as a youth is hard enough just being born here, let alone navigating a new culture and the peer pressures that come with that. Do you dress the right way? Accents, have the right apps on social media, attend the right parties, lots of different things. At the same time, their family may be putting on additional pressure at home, trying to make sure that language, tradition, culture, and religion are not lost. And so youth often are found that they're being pulled between identities of who are they in this new country. And I do want to acknowledge that smaller and rural centers face additional barriers due to reduced transportation, resources, employment, diversity, and again, that sense of connection to people of similar backgrounds. So those challenges of settlement can actually contribute to increased risk of gender-based violence, as well as the challenges to accessing supports and services. So these are kind of now the challenges to accessing supports. And so I will just highlight a few of them, but concern for family in a new country. Many newcomers, when they come, they're very protective of their family. And even if there is violence within the home, they they could be very concerned that they don't want anything to happen to that person. So even if there's violence, they may want the violence to stop, but they don't want negative consequences on the perpetrator, knowing that the systems can be challenging to navigate as a newcomer. As well, they might be concerned about the impact on their family. If a family separates, how does that impact the children? How does that impact extended families? There could be backlash as well. So they're concerned about their whole family unit and how that impacts their settlement journey together. The other thing is there could be fear and mistrust of police and services. This could be a result of experiences in their home country, as well as experiences here in Nova Scotia. And so there could be mistrust with wanting to trust service providers or police, or anyone in authority to due to kind of experiences of racism or unsure how processes work, how will it impact their status, lots of different concerns. And that leads to status concerns, which we're going to hear a little bit more about from the other speakers, but immigration status concerns are a huge, huge concern. There's the last one I'll highlight a little bit is the lack of, the fear of stigma as well from the community. People may not want to be isolated if the violence is happening within their community. They might be worried about being ostracized or isolated from their community, or backlash from the community itself if they're accusing someone within it. And sometimes your own kind of community supports are really important in the settlement journey, and the risk of losing that or being stigmatized could be really, really detrimental to someone's settlement here in Canada. I also want to acknowledge that recognizing abuse and all the other issues around economic challenges such as finances, job, housing, employment would really impact someone's ability. And I will acknowledge too that immigrants may feel less likely to report due to racism against someone who's not an immigrant, thinking that the system might be unfair due to racism and discrimination. And so they might also be fearful of reporting against someone who is also Canadian, a citizen. I do want to acknowledge that when we're talking about prevention and support, we need to use a trauma and violence informed approach. We need to do it from a cultural humility lens and be culturally and religiously sensitive about how we're talking about those programs and services. Um, this is something we do in our gender-based violence program. We have newcomer staff leading newcomer-specific programs and bringing that lens of sensitivity. We have to work in an anti-oppressive approach, understanding power dynamics and privilege, and that includes anti-racism. Obviously, we need to be intersectionality approach as well, a feminist lens, and always be client-centered. Additional things when working with newcomers, if you're thinking of prevention programming, would be to create both gender inclusive and gender specific opportunities for programs and workshops. Due to the accessibility, some people may prefer to be in a gender inclusive space and not choose between binaries. Others may only want to access a gendered space. Ensure staff are educated and trained. Representation matters. Who is telling it, the language they're telling it, the way you're marketing, the visuals that you're using. Are they inclusive of everyone? Are they inclusive of the populations that you're trying to reach? Engage men and boys. Men and boys need to be actively involved in part of the solution. And so that's something that we focus a lot on, is engaging newcomer men and boys to see themselves as champions and to see their role in prevention. We also need to engage children and youth early with age-appropriate programming, and also to help support newcomers understanding why we may be talking about certain issues earlier as a violence prevention initiative. We also do place-based programming initiatives, go where people are already gathering. Collaborations are essential. So if you're someone who's working in the anti-violence sector, collaborate with those who are working with newcomers. If you're someone who's working directly with newcomers, collaborate with experts in the anti-violence and gender-based violence sector. We need to stop working in silos and build collaborative processes, because that's how we can address intersectionality and the different aspects of people's identity. And we need to connect both to GBV awareness as well as prevention. We need to address not just what is gender-based violence, but also the root causes like homophobia and transphobia, like discrimination based on ability, like sexism, like victim blaming, like toxic masculinity. Lots of different prevention factors. We need to focus more on that, and we need to engage those at highest risk of experiencing violence. Just because this webinar is very short, I did feel it was important to still say that there are lots of best practices when working with anybody, not just newcomers, if someone discloses violence. But the reality is often newcomers will go to the person they're closest to, and that could be a settlement worker, that could be a teacher, that could be a community worker. And so often newcomers will build trust with the first few agencies that they're connected with. And so it might take a while to bridge that gap and want to reach out to GBV sectors. And so everyone needs to be prepared in how to navigate disclosures so that they don't perpetuate harm. So again, don't interrupt. We don't ask why questions that could enforce victim blaming, like, why did you do that? Or why were they angry? Things like that. Be trauma informed, and there's lots of trainings to learn what does trauma informed mean. So I encourage people to take those. Always assure someone they're believed, it's not their fault, and that support is available. And ensure choice, which is a method of being trauma informed, and that clients are centered in the decision making that happens. And help support a risk and assessment plan, safety plan, sorry, risk assessment and safety plan, and connect with organizations who do that formally and have expertise in that. And you can do that with them, you can refer them, or you can call them for advice and share resources and supports. And we do want to acknowledge in this webinar that be aware and follow duty to report laws and requirements when children are involved. However, if a victim of violence also has children, make sure you're supporting them in that process and calling with them or finding ways to support them in that process. Additional considerations for newcomers is using simple language, provide interpretation when possible, and make sure the interpretation is not by family members. Be cautious of community-based interpretation to make sure that it's not someone close to the person. Nova Scotia is very small. And so make sure that you provide a list of gender and names and photos, even if possible, to the person so they can acknowledge if that person might be someone they're not comfortable with interpreting. Make sure they're trained interpreters bound by confidentiality. Be aware that they may prefer to speak to someone from their own culture, religion, or background. It might not be you, and that's okay, and respect that. At the same time, don't assume that. They may prefer to speak to someone not from their community. We have to be mindful of both. Avoid making assumptions based on culture, religion, or identity. Ask about immigration status, not in a way that's accusatory, because we're going to learn a little bit that status is a fear. A lot of people are uncomfortable disclosing it for fear of accessing supports or what that might mean. So explain, I want to understand your status because there are certain supports that might be available to you and might differ, and different considerations that we might need to take into account based on the status of you as well as your children. And again, connect with immigration status experts to make sure that that is not forgotten. Dispel myths around deportation and processes, share rights, laws, and information. Support warm referrals. So again, we can't just hand someone a phone number and expect them to trust that organization. See if we can call together. Ask if you want to go with them. There's lots of ways we can support warm referrals because, again, a lot of newcomers that we work with, sometimes the only one they know is 911 and think that police and official reports are the only thing they can do to access supports. Ensure that if you're doing a risk assessment or safety plan, that they're done in a culturally aware and informed process. There are different risk assessments and safety plans that take into account immigrant, newcomer, and refugee additional factors. So make sure that those things are taken into consideration, which might be different than someone who's born here. And be aware of the settlement challenges that may need to be considered with ongoing support that someone may require. Language, they might require more support accessing financial services or skills or support networks, or language or interpretation, or kind of that peer supportive space. So you might need to connect with other supports as well. And continue to connect with organizations that do that work with newcomers for support when needed. Also, we want to mention to please be aware that there might be increased pressure on victims and survivors to remain with family units. This might be pressure from the family, from the community as well. They might also have justifications to stay in situations of abuse because of the increased pressures of settlement and being in a new country. And so we need to support people who also do not want to leave and how to remain safe and have supports. I do want to just acknowledge, because again, this webinar is very short, that there is so many resources available in Nova Scotia. They are all available on the Nova Scotia government website, as well as there's a Nova Scotia Violence Resource Center. The link is at the bottom. But there are many supports and resources available, many of which are on the screen right now. But again, there are actually even more so than I could fit on this slide, but I just wanted to acknowledge that support and help is available. And the final thing I just wanted to mention is that thank you so much for listening and centering, understanding kind of the intersections of working with newcomers. And for more information on our national or local programming, we have our websites. So I will leave it there for that. Thank you so much. And now that I've done an overview of kind of newcomers and GBV, we're going to start diving into the intersectionality, and I'm going to invite Tammy Bernaski, who's going to be speaking next, specifically focusing on the lens of working with people with disabilities and that intersection and additional risks for GBV. Tammy is an assistant professor of political science at Cape Breton University. She has a PhD in critical disability studies from York University. Using an intersectional approach, her research is focused on understanding the impacts of oppression and developing pathways to empowerment. She specializes in addressing GBV violence in the disability community. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation to be a part of the presentation panel today. Today I'm going to talk about gender-based violence in the disability community. My focus is more broad, as I've done work internationally looking at gender-based violence in the disability community. I'll start by just describing myself. I'm a middle-aged woman with red glasses. I have blonde hair, and I'm wearing I guess a brown jacket with a yellow and brown scarf. Okay, so I thought I would start by defining disability because people have different ideas of disability when they hear the term. And I'm going to rely here on the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. They define disability as an evolving concept. That's as far as they go in defining disability. If you need to be a little bit more specific in terms of what you think about when you think about disability, I would suggest thinking about disability as physical, mental, intellectual, learning, sensory, neurodivergent, or episodic in nature, and really thinking about how that experience interacts with the environment or society to create barriers. So it's really about the barriers that people face. And in terms of disability, the global average is that around 15% of the global population has a disability. In Nova Scotia, the most recent statistics suggest that 37.9% of people in Nova Scotia over the age of 15 have a disability, 15 or older. So in terms of thinking about women with disabilities are 2 to 3 more times likely than those without disabilities to experience violence. Thank you, Brianna, for the statistic there. It's true that 60 to 70% of women, up to 70% of women with intellectual disabilities experience violence. But as Brianna said, it's for all types of disabilities, it's around 60%. Women with disabilities are also more likely to experience physical, sexual, emotional, and psychological abuse. We're going to talk a little bit about the specific kinds of violence that people with disabilities can experience. So in terms of the kinds of experiences that people have when they experience violence, women with disabilities can experience all the kinds of violence that Brianna talked about earlier. There are some other forms of violence, though, that should be considered here. One is the withholding of care or medical devices or medication. So this is known as caregiver abuse, and this can often happen without people knowing about it. Intentionally isolating someone, and this is a bit different than the other kinds of isolation that might happen. So here, a person with a disability might be kept at home or perhaps their caregiver, it won't help them communicate. So there's lots of concern about a person being able to be out in the community. Withholding financial and other resources. So here, even charging more for services and things like that might happen. And then denying reproductive rights, so sterilization procedures may happen, or the denial of parenting as well. And then, of course, things like forced institutionalization and psychiatric interventions, which can be violent for many women with disabilities. So I haven't focused specifically on immigrant or newcomer women with disabilities, but there has been some work done in this area, of course. And Parandosa talks about how um, she has a book, actually. You could take a look if you Google it, you can find her book. But she talks about how newcomer women with disabilities may be viewed as an additional social burden or unable to contribute to the labor market. And there's also been research to suggest that there's very few services that support both settlement and accessibility needs. So that's a concern for newcomer and immigrant women with disabilities. So my research, as I said in the beginning, is a bit more broad. I interviewed 13 community advocates and organizers globally. And I really wanted to know about the motivations and challenges in doing the work to end gender-based violence. So I was really looking at the also the impact of community organizing. So I wanted to look at what are some of the challenges, but what also are the transformations. And I was very fortunate that I had responses from a number of countries: Australia, Bangladesh, Canada, Ghana, India, Kenya, the United States, Nepal, and Yemen. So there was all kinds of things that the participants talked about, but I'm just going to focus here on a few things that might be key takeaways, I guess you could say. They talked about lack of representation in different movements. I was looking at social movement organizing, so they were talking about different movements, whether it was the gender and women's movement or the disability rights movement. So a lack of cross representation. A really big concern, and I think this impacts many people with disabilities in all kinds of contexts, are things like negative perceptions. And we can see this a lot in the media. So perceptions of people with disabilities as, you know, their lives are tragic or pitiful, monstrous even sometimes, lots of different concerns there, even infantilization of people with disabilities. And then they talked about excessive barriers when trying to access basic education, abuse at university, and then harassment when trying to enter the workforce. So really different kinds of experiences all throughout the life process. In terms of structural barriers, participants who worked with, they all identified as women and trans people with disabilities, and they also worked within community. They talked about how shelters are often in older buildings that can't be retrofitted. And they also talked about how a person's identity doesn't often fit neatly into systems. So, you know, thinking about the ways that we qualify for different kinds of services, services are often designed to screen people out. And then, of course, the forced medicalization of disability in order to access services, which can be problematic in terms of thinking about immigrants with disabilities. They may not want to disclose a medical disability for all kinds of different reasons. But often, in order to access services, you have to disclose a medical aspect to your disability. I spent a lot of time looking at structural violence, and this is really how negative perceptions of disability may interact with policies and procedures, all of these kinds of things to create structural violence. I talked to participants who talked about the abuse of young women with disabilities and respite care. So sometimes one woman I spoke to, she worked with, she had some parents contact her because they were concerned that whenever they sent their young daughter to respite care at this institution for a very short period of time, they were concerned that she might be abused. And so they wanted to figure out how they could um, sterilize her. And of course, the woman that I interviewed stressed the importance of trying to address the systemic issues there rather than trying to enact a medical procedure on a young child. They also talked about systemic barriers combined with negative perceptions, whether it's policies and things like that, and then relying on service providers even after complaints have been filed. So in one case, a person talked about how they had filed a complaint against a um, transit driver and then had to be picked up by that same transit driver the next day. And then being kept away from community, so being kept in the home, was also a form of structural violence. In terms of the challenges, the Violence Against Women with Disabilities Violence Prevention Review was done in 2011, and they identified a number of challenges. And some of those challenges I also found in my own research with the participants that I spoke to, particularly around accessing the justice system or the absence of supports for forming and maintaining strong networks. Other kinds of challenges might be disclosing abuse, and then the absence of healthcare intervention, so not getting the right kind of healthcare when it's needed. So in terms of what's on the screen here, whatever is in asterisks was also found in my research. And again, other things that was found both in the report in 2011, but then also reaffirmed with my research in 2020 to 2022, was a lack of sensitivity training for professionals in terms of identity around disability and things like that, a lack of rights education and self-advocacy training for women with disabilities. A lot of times people didn't even know what rights they had in terms of trying to get um, action taken on something that might have happened to them, for example, and then a lack of funding and resources to enhance the accessibility of intervention services. And then in terms of transformations, the participants talked about seeing themselves represented in different movements. A lot of the people that I worked with, I interviewed, sorry, they talked about how they wanted to raise awareness about violence against women and trans people with disabilities, and how being a part of that process was actually empowering for them as well. And then, of course, community organizing and network support were also really important. And to wrap up, I would say that awareness is key in supporting all women with disabilities who might be at risk of multiple forms of violence. Recognizing forms of abuse and understanding various types of accommodations is critical in addressing gender-based violence. And so I'll just conclude there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tammy, for sharing both your research and bringing in together other reports and research to really raise awareness about that intersectionality of people with disabilities and the increased challenges to access services, lack of visibility, and just increased risk factors as well. And it's clear that we have a long way to go, both in funding and increased supports and services, both in prevention and intervention, as well as just the representation of those voices being heard. So thank you so much for bringing that to our attention and to kind of emphasizing this. We're now going to be shifting into another important point. So we're going to actually have two speakers in a moment talking about the intersectionality of identity, status, and gender. And so the first person I'm going to be bringing to speak is Rhiannon Makahoniak. She is a white Canadian-born settler and a queer trans woman. She leads with her heart and works from an empowerment and social justice framework. Rhiannon's work is informed by her social work education, a background in queer and trans community organizing, and 7 years working in the settlement sector. Rhiannon is passionate about creating safer and welcoming spaces for 2S LGBTQIA+ newcomers. And she is the co-executive director of the Rainbow Refugee Association of Nova Scotia, which is an organization that directly supports these communities. And she wants to continue to advocate for better support for LGBTQIA+ refugees within the settlement sector and to build capacity for LGBTQIA+ refugee sponsorship across Nova Scotia and the Atlantic. I would really like to welcome and bring in Rhiannon. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Brianna. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me today. As Brianna said, my name is Rhiannon. I'm one of the co-executive directors at Rainbow Refugee Association of Nova Scotia. We are a nonprofit and registered charity that has been around since 2011. And in that time, we have privately sponsored now 49 LGBTQI refugees to resettle in Nova Scotia. So primarily, we engage in direct private sponsorship work, which means connecting with people abroad, writing sponsorship applications, and then supporting them once they arrive in Canada. But we also do some other work, including providing settlement supports and community integration programming for all types of LGBTQI refugees and newcomers, like a pottery program, a biweekly hangout, and more recently some career and financial well-being workshops. But it's a little bit about what we do as an organization. So, what brings me here today is to talk about the intersection of gender-based violence with to us LGBTQIA identities and with kind of like migration experience or previous history living as a refugee. So, on a base level, you know, all of the people that we work with at RANS are LGBTQI refugees. So all of the people that we work with have experienced some form of gender-based violence. We know that gender-based violence is, as Bree talked about, violence that's experienced. It can be a range of different things based on someone's gender or experience of gender, including sexuality. Um, and everybody we work with is somebody who has fled their country of origin based on direct violence or persecution experienced because of their sexual orientation, gender identity, and or expression, and or their sex characteristics. So these kind of parameters. Um, and this this gender-based violence is kind of rooted in a hatred or discomfort of people outside of like heteronormative cisgender kind of experiences. So when we're talking about LGBTQI refugees or people who are living here as newcomers who were refugees, this is a group of people who has like increased vulnerability, and they've also likely faced discrimination or forms of gender-based violence along their entire settlement journey. So from fleeing their country of origin, in seeking asylum in second countries where they may experience violence from officials working there, other people fleeing from community members. The countries themselves may be like politically or legislatively hostile towards LGBTQI people. And then in seeking resettlement to Canada, people also may experience gender-based violence. Canada as a country globally sells itself as being like a cultural mosaic and a place of like multiculturalism, but we know, I mean, we're here today. We know that violence still exists, discrimination still exists. And queer and trans refugees who resettle in Canada still experience different forms of homophobia and transphobia on top of experiences of racism, discrimination, xenophobia, etc. So this kind of discrimination or gender-based violence that people experience across their settlement journey may also cause issues with trust, issues with kind of authority or lack of safety from like helping organizations, quote unquote. And it may also create instances of like lack of connection from cultural communities, and upon arrival from 2S LGBTQIA communities within Canada, because of experiences of like racism, discrimination, othering in general. So, the work that we do is kind of creating space for people who might feel ostracized or others from communities that they could connect with, but might not. So as Brianna and Tammy talked about, there's many kind of forms of violence that people experience. So I don't think I need to go into those kind of further, except to say, like, you know, many people experience many different levels of violence, from like interpersonal to kind of systemic and state-based violence, based on gender and sexuality. So once people arrive in Canada, they may face a host of barriers or challenges in accessing supports. So this kind of population, everybody's like an individual, but in general may have issues finding services or supports that are both LGBTQI affirming, and also culturally aware. So trying to find like a therapist who maybe has like shared language or comfort or knowledge working with specific cultural identities, but also is LGBTQI affirming, may be difficult to find. We know that like some settlement organizations are not always a safe space for queer and trans people as well. Kind of leading before what I talked about people maybe having some distrust or experience previous hostility from like larger organizations and international supports. There may be a lack of like trust or difficulty around privacy, identities, and this concept of like being quote unquote out or disclosing one's identity. So organizations and like individuals within organizations as well need to create kind of like openly safer spaces so that people can have the space to disclose their identities if they choose, in order for them to access like meaningful services, programming, etc. Brianna touched on the point of affirming interpretation and translation, like echoing that and adding the lens that like as well, like finding interpretation within cultural communities has like interesting components and things to navigate, but also having interpreters use language for like gender, sexuality, bodies, different things, that's affirming as well, can be a challenge. So really quick in the last kind of 2 minutes here, some things you can do. So systemically, like we need better public policy systems and supports for vulnerable people, and increase protections for people of various identities. Organizationally, rearrange your data and forms, include like pronouns, different gender and sexuality options available when necessary, or if not necessary, maybe don't have it. Have different washroom options available for people. Have training for staff members, not just on like just LGBTQIA identities, but also how to have conversations with people about things like pronouns or respect, or like different identities, diversity, etc. Having partnerships between organizations. If something's not in your lane, I bet you can find someone else in the community who can support somebody well. Having individualized assessments or goals, or supports that take somebody into account as an individual and not a generalized person who any kind of shoe can fit, so to speak. and having things like codes of conduct, reporting mechanisms, etc. On an individual or interpersonal level, what can you do? People are the experts of their own experiences. If you listen, people will tell you how they want to be treated. They'll tell you how to address them, what words or language to use, and you can like mirror that back with empathy, respect, and understanding. Um, and I guess in a final note, like you in your service delivery in your daily life, you may not know who is queer or trans or holds some type of 2S LGBTQIA identity. But people kind of disclosing their identities comes from a place of trust and safety, and a desire to have their whole selves brought into conversations about services or supports they receive. So try and foster that trust and safety. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate that, the work that you and the Rainbow Refugee Association of Nova Scotia is doing, and just the expertise and the work that your organization is essentially as a result of gender-based violence and people experiencing it. So your entire existence is kind of supporting this need and gap. I really just want to say thank you for emphasizing the multi-layered challenges of settlement, of kind of the further isolation, the further othering that might happen within the larger community, within their own cultural community. But as you mentioned, even service providers, just trying to find service providers that are both LGBTQ sensitive and culturally sensitive. And I really appreciate the emphasis around the interpretation around LGBTQ friendly terminology. This is something that is often neglected and forgotten. So thank you so much. I also just want to say as well as I really appreciate the emphasis around connecting with the experts. So again, like if you or your organization doesn't know the information, reach out to RANds, reach out to organizations doing that work. They can support you, they can connect, they may have services and supports, but what is not okay is to cause harm. So again, I really appreciate that. And the last point that you made, I just want to hold on to it, is treat people how they want to be treated. I often hear that, the golden rule is treat people how you want to be treated. It's the platinum rule. Treat people how they want to be treated. So just thank you for emphasizing that that might be different depending on people's experience. So thank you so much. And we are now going to be shifting to another speaker who's going to be talking specifically about refugee claimants and asylum seekers. This next person is from the Halifax Refugee Clinic. Her name is Najla Al-Zanin, and she is an immigrant from the Gaza Strip, Palestine, and a passionate advocate for women empowerment and community development. Since coming to Canada, she has worked extensively with refugee and immigrant women at the Antigonish Women's Resource Center, and currently is the settlement worker of the Halifax Refugee Clinic in Halifax. Najla helps refugees navigate challenges within systems, advocates for their rights to access services, and supports their settlement in Canada. She is also pursuing her master's in adult education, women's leadership, and community development, and aims to continue fostering inclusivity and support for refugee and immigrants within marginalized communities. So I just really want to thank and welcome Najla. And I just want to point out that Najla will not be having her camera on today just to support some internet connection, but we welcome Najla. Thank you so much. It's off to you.
Thank you so much, Brianna, for this introduction, and thank you so much for having me. I'm going to share my screen. So just give me a second. So I just want to introduce the Halifax Refugee Clinic and talk a bit about its work. So Halifax Refugee Clinic, it's a non-governmental and non-profit organization, and it was the lawyer Lee Cohen started it in 2000. This organization, or the Halifax Refugee Clinic, provides a no-cost legal settlement for people, like for refugee claimant, protected person, and non-status migrant. We try to fill the gap that the government left in order to support the refugee claimant and protected person and non-status people. Uh, for the immigration status that we have in Canada, I just want to mention and differentiate between the status that we have. So, in order to make the refugee claimant status clear, so we have the refugee claim, we have the temporary residence when some people come to Canada with a temporary residence, like maybe foreigner workers, students, and tourists. And this is where the refugee claimant status located there, but it's a conditional on their hearing. We have the permanent resident, which is someone who is staying in Canada and has the permanent residence. They can leave and come back, and they can stay in Canada until they get their citizenship. The citizen of Canada is any person who is a Canadian by birth, or who already applied for the Canadian citizenship through the IRCC. In order to talk a, talk talk a bit about the refugee claimant, I just want to mention that the refugee are a diverse group of people, and there is no specific type of person who is refugee. Refugee status is not a situation that person is a choose. It's only because they leave their country, they can't stay there peacefully, because of a war or any conflict that they have. So they try to find peace and leave their country. For the Canadian sorry. So yeah, for the Canadian refugee protection programs, we have the refugee who come here under humanitarian and resettlement program, and they are a sponsored refugee. But the refugee claimant are the refugee who come to Canada and they claim, and they become refugee claimants after they start their process here. I want to also mention that the process of refugee claim is a long process. So within this process that lasts sometimes from 1 to 4 years, refugee claimants unfortunately are not eligible for many of the services that we have here in Nova Scotia, such as getting the MSI card, the health card, to access some health services. They are not eligible for housing. They are not eligible to study until they receive the positive hearing from the court of the immigration, and they should receive the positive hearing in order to start their PR application. Uh, and their status will change from refugee claimants to protected persons. And they will stay waiting for the PR application to be finalized, maybe for 2 to 3 years. Within this time, they can only receive the MSI card, but some of the services still are not available for them. I want to mention that also we serve many refugee claimants from all over the world. This is only like some of the countries that we receive some of refugee claimants. And we try to support all of them, provide them with the legal support and settlement support. As I mentioned, the refugee claimants are not eligible for the MSI card. But at the same time, the government, the IRCC, provide them with something called refugee claimants protected refugee protection claimant document, and this document helps them to receive and reach and access some of the health service, but it's not like MSI card. For the clients that we have in our office. So we have some research that we have done recently. So recent research on sexual and gender-based violence revealed that approximately there is a 30% of the Halifax Refugee Clinic clients have suffered from this form of violence, mostly domestic violence. And we have approximately 70% of this number are women and girls. Also, the same research shows that sexual and gender violence continue to affect survivors emotionally and mentally, and in some cases physically, even after their arrival in Canada. Also, our experience is like deeply rooted in our commitments to address diverse forms of GBV affecting our clients. On the legal side, in terms of basis of refer claims, we regularly see we have encountered numerous instances of GBV, including intimate partner violence, also sexual assault, human trafficking, forced marriage, and many cases. And even if the claim is not technically made of the basis of gender or gender violence, it's almost intersect with, like for example, it's a treatment, persecution of a journalist or a human rights activities or political opposition member, or ethnic minority faces can be GBV related, such as sexual assault. GBV intersect with precarious immigrant status. Like these experiences are exacerbated by the precarious immigration status of our clients and their lack of access of many services, as I mentioned, and many benefited available to other residents of the province and the country. And inform our tolerant approach to support and advocacy and our necessary intervention at all these levels. Precarious immigration status intersect with this topic. They are a venue for solution or reduce the likelihood of GBV, and I also pointed of exclusive and increase the potential of GBV. So these are all the intersection areas like housing, education, legal aid, employment, income, and health care. I just want to talk about the triple trauma, triple point of a trauma. So the experiences of forcing migration and GBV refugee survivors of sexual and gender violence are caught in a triple point of trauma and suffering. So the initial flight and escape from one's homeland into a foreign country, also the experiencing of a claim refugee and the waiting time, retelling and reliving also the refugee story in their country of refuge, and then the practical trauma associated with sexual and gender-based violence, which has certain complicity and required additional support. So in Nova Scotia, refugee claimants don't receive the host of service generally provided in other provinces. So access to service that are available requires constant advocacy, and this is what we are trying always to do in our clinic. So in terms of the main reason for seeking asylum, or it may exacerbate the fear of persecution. Sexual and gender-based violence is also inherited in the experience of seeking refuge. So for the refugee, it may form the main reason of seeking asylum, or it may exacerbate the fear of persecution. Also, we have the legal gap and issue of interpretation and assumption of credibility, limited or non-existent service. Also, we have the long waiting period resulted in a re-victimization of survivor. I think this is all what I wanted to mention in this 10 minutes. Thank you, and I turn it to you, Periana.
Thank you so much, Najla. That was so important. Thank you for the expertise of you and the amazing work of the Halifax Refugee Clinic that they're doing. And the reality is that they are also filling such a huge gap by both the government and service providers to better support refugee claimants who are clearly at an increased risk of violence, but also such barriers to accessing supports. I just am amazed to hear again that the fact that 1/3 of your claimants have experienced GBV, and even those who that's not part of their claimant, you said that GBV is often part of kind of that story. The fact they can't access legal aid, can't access health cards, and even their health care is not often accepted by service providers shows that systemic barrier. Not eligible for housing, subsidy in public housing, and legal aid. Again, and the fact that they're not eligible for a lot of services and supports that are, as you mentioned, available in other provinces shows that we have a long way to go. So I just really want to emphasize thank you to the Halifax Refugee Clinic for filling such an obvious gap for a population that is clearly at an increased risk if they cannot access services like language, if they cannot access supports for legal aid and housing. It definitely reinforces someone to potentially be at risk of experiencing violence, but also if they are in a violent situation, they may not leave because of these additional challenges. So thank you so much, Najla, for that. We are now going to be moving on to another type of status and another particular intersection that is often a huge gap in our province. So I'm very excited to welcome Stacey Gomez, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Migrant Worker Rights in Nova Scotia. Stacey has been active in movements of racial and gender justice, corporate accountability, and migrant rights for over 15 years. Her experience includes frontline service provision, coordinating grassroots campaigns, and advocating nationally for policy change. Stacey is also a first-generation university graduate with an MA in Development Studies from York University. It is my pleasure to invite Stacey Gomez, and I will hand it over to you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. I'm happy to be part of this event. I'm gonna now share my screen. All right. So I want to start by just providing a brief overview of the work that the Center for Migrant Worker Rights Nova Scotia does. So we primarily work with migrant workers in the agriculture sector, seafood sector, but we support migrant workers in a range of other sectors as well. Our work includes educating migrant workers about their rights, providing support in situations of abuse, workplace injuries, or other vulnerable situations, community building, as well as organizing and advocating for changes to improve the rights of migrant workers in the province as well as nationally. So, for example, we're part of the Migrant Rights Network. That's a coast-to-coast network of migrant organizations throughout the country. So when we talk about migrant workers, another name for migrant workers is temporary foreign workers. That's because migrant workers are typically are coming through the temporary foreign worker program, but this program includes many streams and programs. So that includes the agriculture stream, and we also have the seasonal agricultural workers program. We have a high wage stream, low wage stream, global talent stream, etc. So when I talk about migrant workers in the seafood processing sector, many of the workers that we're working with, like many of the workers that we're working with, they're in the they're low-wage migrant workers. So they're coming through the low-wage stream. Many migrant workers in the agriculture sector in Nova Scotia are coming through the seasonal agricultural workers program. And here's an overview of the key industries where migrant workers are working in Canada. So as we can see, agriculture is a key industry. So bringing it to the Nova Scotia context, since 2015 to 2023, the number of migrant workers coming to Nova Scotia has almost tripled. And the majority of migrant workers coming to Canada are men. So we can see that in the statistics, but for example, in the caregiving sector, we know that the majority are women. So Canada has been criticized for many years for the temporary foreign worker program and specifically closed work permits. Uh, Closed work permits tie migrant workers to one employer, and they're only legally able to work with that employer. So a UN report that came out earlier this year received a lot of attention, and it criticized this program and closed work permits in Canada as serving as a breeding ground for contemporary forms of slavery, as it institutionalizes asymmetries of power that favor employers and prevent workers from exercising their rights. So I do want to delve into that more. Why is this the case? So we know that there are many structural reasons for the abuse that migrant workers are experiencing when they come to work in Canada. Our organization receives on a regular basis calls for migrant workers throughout the province who are in situations of abuse. So that's because of these structural factors. I talked about the closed work permits. Also, migrant workers coming to Canada have a temporary immigration status, which is tied to their employment. And this means that they can easily be fired, they're easily deportable, and so this makes it difficult for them to exercise their rights. Though on paper they have many of the same rights as Canadians, their ability to exercise those rights is limited by these structural barriers that I'm talking about. This makes migrant workers vulnerable to abuse, including gender-based violence. There's also a number of other risk factors to consider as well. Many migrant workers, for example, in the agriculture and the seafood processing sector, live in employer-owned housing. That means that their employer is also their landlord. There's generally a lack of knowledge of their rights when they're coming to Nova Scotia. There is isolation because oftentimes they're living in rural communities. There may be language barriers and also racism. There's also a lack of knowledge of what services are available and just a general lack of availability of services because of their immigration status. They also typically work in non-unionized work environments, and they face a lot of risks in their work. They're typically doing work that Canadians do not want to be doing. That's characterized by the 3 Ds: difficult, dirty, dangerous, and sometimes deadly. In addition, Typically, we're talking about, as I mentioned, agriculture is an industry where predominantly men are employed. That means there's a lack of job opportunities for women. And so they feel like they have to put up with this abuse because there's just such a little opportunities for them if they do complain. And also, when we're talking about, for example, women, migrant workers coming through the seasonal agricultural workers program, many are single mothers, so they have an increased dependence on these jobs due to their roles as single mothers in this case. I want to talk about some of the cases that we're seeing around gender-based violence. We know that there is an underreporting in general of forms of gender-based violence, including sexual violence. And for the migrant worker community, given the hyper vulnerability that they experience, it's even more difficult to know the extent of the violence that they're experiencing, and gender-based violence in this case. So I want to talk about a few stories that have become public. A lot of them are people have shared pseudonyms. Migrant workers oftentimes do not feel safe enough to speak out publicly about the experiences that they have because of the risks that they face to doing so. So I want to talk about a few stories. So the first is the story of Teresa. And she was attacked by her boss on a farm in British Columbia in 2014. And she reported this. And in this case, the Crown decided that there was not enough evidence to proceed with the charges. And there's another case, this one from Ontario. This is from 2015. And there was a very important decision made by the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal that I want to speak about. So in this ruling, the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario found that a company named Prestige Foods Limited, it was a seafood processor, had discriminated against two women migrant workers from Mexico who came under the temporary foreign worker program. And it found that they were exposed to sexual solicitation, sexual harassment, discrimination in employment, and a sexually poisoned work environment, to quote that decision. And the tribunal awarded $200,000 to these two complainants. So I want to read an excerpt from the decision. Quote, as a result of the nature of the temporary foreign workers programs in Canada, MPT, which is the pseudonym used for the workers, one of the workers, worked under an ever-present threat of being sent back to Mexico if she did not do what she was told, which was made explicit to her by the employer and which was ultimately acted upon by him in a discriminatory manner. And just to explain that part, what ended up happening is that the two women had tried to say no to their employer, and they ended up being sent back to Mexico. So continuing with the quote, migrant workers live under the ever-present threat of having their designated employer decide to end the employment relations for which they require no reason and for which there is no appeal or review. Next, I want to share just some quotes from one of the workers. So she shared, I want to tell all women that are in a similar situation that they should not be silent and that there is justice and they should not accept mistreatment or humiliation. We must not stay silent. As a migrant, one feels that she or he has to stay here in the workplace and there is nowhere to go and no one to talk to. Under the temporary foreign worker program, the boss has all the power over your money, house, status, everything. They have you tied to their will. It has been 8 years to obtain justice, but 8 years and justice is finally here today. And finally, I want to share a news article that came out earlier this year. Again, another employer was accused of sexually assaulting an employee in the Okanagan in BC. There was a search warrant from the RCMP. I to date haven't seen how this has concluded, but this really shows that these cases are just the tip of the iceberg. So there's a legal clinic in BC, and they this clinic is specifically to assist migrant workers and newcomers who are survivors of sexual assault and harassment. And they mentioned that since 2019, they have worked with over 150 survivors of sexual assault, including many farm workers. And we've also seen examples of this kind of sexual harassment in our work. So I'm just gonna then conclude. So I want to share just some of the ways that our organization supports. So we provide accompaniment, as I mentioned, in situations of abuse or other situations of vulnerability, referrals, translation, and we can also support to apply for what's called a vulnerable worker open work permit. As I mentioned, migrant workers typically are on closed work permits when they come to work in Canada. That's a recipe for abuse, and if they have evidence, they can make an application to open that work permit. But it's just a temporary measure. There's no legal assistance available through the province to support with these applications, so that's something that our organization supports with for free. So that's on our end. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Stacy, for the powerful advocacy and direct support that you and your organization are providing. The fact that migrant workers are such a core part of our province's industries, and yet their rights and safety, as well as access to the basic services, have been hugely neglected or unavailable. And the impact of closed work permits that you said created such a power imbalance that it really does risk the impacts of potential abuse. Like you mentioned, the idea that some live in employment-owned housing, the fact that they can cancel their work permit at any time, and the fact that there's just so much power. It's obvious that they are at a higher risk of experiencing violence, but as well, the invisibility of that because there's so many barriers and risks about reporting. So thank you so much, Stacy. We're now going to hand over this to Jeff, who I think is going to help us navigate some questions that I think are showing up.
Hey, Brianna. I just want to thank everybody, first of all, for sharing so much information about the important work that you're each doing in your organizations. I know this has been a very condensed discussion over 90 minutes. We could have spent double the time and certainly more than that. So I hope that folks will look up your respective organizations and reach out and get in touch should they need to. Brianna, I will actually ask if you could look into the Q&A
Sure.
and perhaps read from it. Again, my reading off of the screen skill is terrible with my vision loss. I do see
Yeah,
two.
sure. So I'll ask some questions. One question was for, I believe, Najla. Can refugee claimants get their kids into schools?
Yes, they can when they have what we call RPCD, which is the Protection Claimant Person. So they have the same status as their parents, but not for the universities.
Thank you, Najla. Another question was, I'm not sure who it's directed at, but you say for medical treatment for newcomers or immigrants, they need to disclose a medical issue. This might be for Tammy. It's been proven that PTSD, depression, anxiety are all considered medical issues. Is this the case for newcomers and immigrants as well? Often you can't see it. It's not real. Are these considered medical issues for newcomers? I feel like there would be a lot of this, especially people coming from war-torn countries. I apologize. That was a bit of a long-worded question. So this could be for Tammy or anyone else who feels able to answer.
Yeah, I think that question came up during my presentation, and it was two different issues that I was talking about. So one issue I was talking about was that often when women with disabilities, generally speaking, go to seek medical assist or medical help in a medical setting. There's a lack of training among medical professionals on how to address different kinds of experiences and recognizing abuse as well, just because there's so many different hidden forms. And then the other thing I had said was that in terms of one of the things I found in my research was that people talked about how people have to disclose a medical diagnosis in order to get access to services. So not necessarily medical treatment, but things like disability supports programs. They're very much reliant upon a medical certificate or a diagnosis, which puts people in a position where they have to disclose information that they might not want to. So those were kind of two different issues, but certainly they impact all women with disabilities, and certainly they would impact immigrants as well and newcomers.
Thank you, Tammy. And I would like to add one additional element of that. A lot of assessment tools that are used for certain diagnoses are done in English in Nova Scotia. And so some people cannot access those diagnoses until a few years in with language, and because interpretation sometimes changes that. So there might be some barriers even with some assessments of certain types of situations. So for people who don't know, in the bottom in the Zoom, there is a question and answer. You can type a question into it. So far, we still have some thanks to you all. Someone else said you inspired me to share my own experience and to provide some steps I took that I found useful when I experienced harassment. Thank you so much. As of right now, there are no other questions, so we'll just give a few more minutes in case someone had a question for any of the speakers today. We'll just leave it for a few minutes just to see. Jeff, or unless you want to, sorry, I can hand it to you as well, Jeff.
We've got 4 or 5 minutes left, so I'm happy to give a moment or two for folks, should anything come to mind and they wanted to drop it into the Q&A. But at the same time, I would invite any of today's speakers, if there were any sort of lingering thoughts or last words that you wanted to share just ahead of our conclusion of this discussion today, I think it would be great.
Sure. There's one more question in, and so then maybe we'll end with those last comments. Someone said, sometimes people don't report because it's, in quotes, too small of a harassment. What do you do then? How do you encourage folks to address that? So I'll open that up to anyone who may want to speak to that.
I mean, you can give people information, but you can't make people do things. It's ultimately somebody's decision to weigh consequences, ramifications, and benefits of acting on that. Yeah, so I would say that's just like autonomy.
Would anyone else like to add to that? Tammy, I see you're unmuted.
Yeah, for people with disabilities, women with disabilities, often if they experience violence from caregivers, for example, or people in their homes, they're often reliant upon those people for daily needs. And so there's a really huge risk for disclosing abuse, because then they're not they're losing the people that might support them in their daily lives, especially when disability supports are so difficult to get. And there's just so many risks there for vulnerability. So I would just echo the comment that you can't force somebody, but you can just support them through coming to the process that they want to come to.
Anyone else want to add to that? One thing I will add as well is sometimes people who think it's too little, just reminding and validating that any form of violence is violence. So if it impacts you, I would reassure them that nothing is too little. We're not comparing violence like a level. So if someone's like, I would validate and say like, yes, that is a form, and yes, that is still harmful, and still echoing what Rhiannon said and Tammy, and then providing them choice and understanding of their options and following their lead. But just wanting to say sometimes people minimize their own experiences, so just empowering them to know like if it impacts you, yes, it's still important.
Also,
Yeah, Jeff.
hop in to underscore that gender-based violence and sexual violence would also include non-physical violence. And so it could include such things and be considered under the Nova Scotia Human Rights Act, which protects against discrimination and harassment. So if you are experiencing harassing behaviors such as sexual harassment based on your gender, gender expression, gender identity, then those would potentially constitute complaints of discrimination under the Nova Scotia Human Rights Act. And so want to ensure folks that if you feel you are being targeted or disproportionately experiencing, harm as a result of your identity, that the commission would be one avenue for you to explore.
There are no further questions, Jeff, and I'm wondering if we're almost at time. Just checking in.
We're exactly time, and that's
Okay.
to your wonderful coordination skills, Brianna. You programmed a really full event, and I'm just so grateful to everybody that was able to attend here today. So thank you once again to all of our presenters. I would like to remind folks that this session was recorded and it will be posted to the Commission's website within 24 hours. So please do share that. As well, there are a couple more important discussions happening under the banner of Nova Scotia Human Rights Week next week. In particular, I'll highlight one that's happening Monday around the history and historical context of disability. And then there's a panel in the afternoon around human rights and the unhoused, which will be attended by the Canadian Federal Housing Advocate and a number of researchers and folks working within the field in Cape Breton. So please check out the Human Rights Commission's website for a number of events that are coming up. And thank you once again to everybody and to Brianna for being such a wonderful host. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.